Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. I would like to thank everyone who has donated to the show. Your contributions help us make the show sustainable. Linode is sponsoring us this week. Check them out at linode.com/podcastinit and get a $20 credit to try out their fast and reliable Linux virtual servers for your next project. Rollbar is also sponsoring us this week. Rollbar is a service for tracking and aggregating your application errors so that you can find and fix the bugs in your application before your users notice they exist. Use the link rollbar.com/podcastinit to get 90 days and 300,000 errors tracked for free on their Bootstrap plan. Hired has also returned as a sponsor this week. If you're looking for a job as a developer or designer, then Hired will bring the opportunities to you. Sign up at hired.com/podcastinit to double your signing bonus. You can also visit our site to subscribe to our show, sign up for our newsletter, read the show notes, and get in touch. And to help other people find the show, you can leave a review on iTunes, Google Play Music, and tell your friends and coworkers. Your host today is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Ji Bao, João Santos, and Lori Apple about their use of Python at Zalando. So, if you guys could introduce yourselves, how about Ji, you go first.
Hi, yes, my name is Jay. I'm a data scientist working Zalando, currently in the team of A/B testing and personalization. So we are actively working with Python and developing on this analysis analytic library, and also our kind of A/B testing self-service platform. So that's kind of a short introduction.
Okay. And João, how about you?
Okay, I'm João. I'm a software engineer for Zalando since last 3 years. I worked mostly on platform level tools. This means tools that are used by other developers. Currently, I work mostly on deployment tools, but I've worked a little bit for everything inside the Zalando platform. It's pretty much it.
And Lori, how about you?
Hi, I'm Lori Apple. I'm the open source evangelist at Zalando and also an agile project manager. So I promote the open source work that we do and build community around the projects and hope the projects grow and succeed.
And going in the same order, how did you each get introduced to Python?
So it might be a bit interesting story for me. I'm actually biologist turned data scientist. So my first kind of software project was with C++ and MATLAB. During time I was doing an internship where it has to do with a simulation of brain, neural networks, and analysis of the connectivity between different cell types. Then later on, during my master thesis, we were kind of working with a mixture of MATLAB and Python, because the simulation tool was built in Python. And then as an initial step that I was actually looking for something to replace MATLAB for visualization. I came to use Matplotlib quite a lot. Of course, realized how. So the Python is such a generic purpose language, and it's kind of powerful, and so currently using it almost on a daily basis.
Okay, so I discovered Python when I was about 14, 15 years old. I was learning programming by myself and trying several different programming languages, and Python was just love at first sight, and since then I've been mostly used Python for my own projects. Zalando is actually the first place where I've done Python professionally. Before I did worked in other languages like PHP and on other inferior languages, but my favorite language is of course Python.
And I just found Python. I was working at Guilt Group, which didn't use Python as a JVM language company, but I'm not a programmer by trade, but I have done some work in Python. I just find it really easy and flexible and fun.
And can you all start by telling us a bit about what Zalando does and some of the technologies that you guys use there?
Sure. So Zalando is possibly not known in to your American listeners, I'm American, and I didn't know what it was until my ex-colleague Eric Bowman became the VP of Engineering about 2 years ago. But it's actually pretty huge in Europe. It's Europe's largest fashion platform, and we do business in 15 countries. We have more than 19 million active customers. We went public in 2014. We're profitable, so there's all kinds of excitement around the company and its growth, and we're consistently expanding, both in terms of the size of the tech team and our presence on the continent with new features, new offerings, new warehouses, new you name it.
Yeah, in terms of technology, we use mostly JVM languages, mostly Java and Scala, but we try to use the right tool for the job for everything. So we also have Python, Go, Clojure, you can name it. So because each team has autonomy to choose technology they want within reason. So we use lots of technologies and we try to use the best ones for each specific case.
And when he says within reason, so we've actually taken a note from ThoughtWorks, who created the Tech Radar, and we have our own Tech Radar. So we have our own preferred languages that we suggest that teams use, so that we don't go off in so many directions that we have chaos on our hands. We need to have multiple teams being able to work on the same service libraries. And if we used every language, it would just be even more difficult for us to contain all of that activity in some reasonable, manageable way.
Yeah, and especially in terms of operational characteristics of being able to deploy each of those different languages, because they all have slightly different mechanisms by which you can put something into production and monitor and maintain it.
Right.
For new services, we don't have that problem really, because we are using Docker. So people just have to take care that they have a working Docker image. For data center, yes, we have to be careful with what we can deploy, and currently we can only deploy Java and Python projects, but for cloud projects, we already support every single technology you can think of.
And you said that Zalando is a fashion platform. Is that somewhat analogous to Stitch Fix here in the States?
More like Zappos.
Okay. And he mentioned that you're using a lot of JVM technologies. I'm wondering, what are some of the typical areas that Python comes into play in your environment?
I think everything from data science to development tools. For example, we have everything from as an internal certificate authority to deployment tools. Both data center and AWS are written in Python. We have lots of other low-level tools that are used by developers, and we also have dashboards and other tools like that.
And we also have Connection, which Zhao worked on. So we're an API first company. We have our own REST API guidelines, which actually describe in detail, like as our own experiences as kind of a use case, and how we're actively working with REST. And Connection is our Python Flask framework for working in a API first, Swagger spec first context.
Yeah, so I can also speak from our team. So as I said, we are not only using Python to develop this analytics library for the analysis for A/B test, but also use that to build some microservice on top of the library, and running our kind of automated testing service.
Yeah, and I noticed on your open source repositories that you've got a few other projects for making Postgres highly available.
The Patroni project, that was developed by us, and we got some collaboration from Red Hat's Josh Berkus, who's been a key figure in the Postgres world for almost as long as Postgres has been around. And so Patroni is one example of how Postgres is so integral to our tooling and our platform infrastructure.
It's eminently flexible and yet still maintains a high degree of stability.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned connection and that you're an API-driven company. I'm wondering what made you guys choose to standardize on the Swagger / Open API specification versus RAML or some of the other Open API standards.
Well, I was not part of the discussion itself, but I noted it was mostly because it was already more popular and it has a better ecosystem than anything else we were aware of. And it seems we made the right choice because the ecosystem is getting better by the day, and we are happy that we helped improve the ecosystem, not only with Connection but also with Swagger first and other tools that we made. To work with Swagger and Open API and allow people to develop API first.
And can you dig a bit into some of the details of what Connection is and I guess some of the internals of how it's built?
Okay, so a little bit of context or why I started Connection. So back at last year, we decided that we were going to do API first and do the Swagger definition first and then start implementation. And I looked at all the Python frameworks that existed for Swagger, and every single one of them generated a definition file out of your code, and I wanted to do the opposite. So I started this new framework as an entirely open source project, and so what Connection does is you give it a Swagger definition file with some extra parameters, like what function should handle each endpoint, and it automatically creates Flask routes for you, and it handles OAuth authentication if you are using it. It handles both request and response validation according to the specification, so it ensures that your code works like documented.
And so when it generates the routes in Flask, does it create stub definitions for each of the different endpoints, and then you go in later and fill them out? And
Connection itself doesn't do that. You have to provide information yourself. But there's one tool on the Swagger website. I don't remember the exact name anymore, but it can generate stub files in several different languages, including in Python with Connection.
And is there a particular reason that you decided to use Flask versus Pyramid or Django or one of the other web frameworks available?
Well, because I really love Flask because it doesn't try to impose any specific way of doing things, and it's very lightweight. Django is also cool, but then it's very opinionated, and it was not the best fit for this kind of project.
And you mentioned that it started its life as an open source project rather than being extracted from something else.
Well, actually, it's been 2 hours inside another project, but yes, it's almost since the beginning a completely separated open source project.
Okay, so it sounds like you realized pretty early on that it would be useful outside of the context of what you were working on.
Yes.
It's good because I'm sure it saved a lot of effort down the road of disentangling it from the rest of your code base and cleaning it up so that it could be used by other people.
Yes, and one of the advantages of doing this is that other people start using it really soon, and they found some initial limitations earlier than I would have done, and they saved me lots of time later.
Yeah, and I've also found that if you start something with the intent of it being open source from the beginning, it can also lead to some better design decisions because you're less likely to tightly couple the implementation to the rest of the things that you're creating.
Yes, exactly.
And going back a bit to the operational characteristics at Zalando, you mentioned that you're using Docker for a lot of your modern services. I'm wondering if there are any particular architectural aspects to your systems that you use to keep them easy to maintain and reason about, particularly with the breadth of different technologies that are used inside of the company.
Well, about technologies, usually if you decide to use some technology, you need to have a group of people inside Zalando that know how to maintain that project, projects in that technology. So you don't get, otherwise you get in a dead end if someone left the company, and that's the only thing we have to take care of. So just one more thing. So the idea where we are trying to move now is that whoever writes the services also runs them. We are creating tools to allow people to manage their own services easily, and so at least for the platform teams, we are taking an hands-off approach and trust teams to do the right choices.
Yeah, that's a good way to encourage better reliability and stability in the applications when the people who are writing the application are also the ones who, if it crashes, get woken up in the middle of the night.
We also try to have solid testing, and there are teams specifically helping backend and front-end teams to create reliable services, and I think they are having good results there.
And as part of the product development cycle, you mentioned that you guys use A/B testing and that you created the XPAN library as part of that effort. I'm wondering if you can describe a bit about what it is and how it's implemented.
Yes. So expand first of all stands for experiment analysis. So basic idea is that, of course, Zalando is not only a tech company, so we are also kind of like a data-driven company. So want to base our decisions on data, and one of the key elements is, of course, A/B testing or randomized experiments. We study the causal relationship between a certain, what we call treatment to the customer, and how they behave afterwards on the website or in terms of transactions. So the library was designed to be a standalone tool that can be really, and I can also very probably say that it's also currently used both for some kind of ad hoc analysis done by typically a data scientist or a data analyst, and as well as used by our microservice, so to say, really integrated in the whole platform and running the analysis after a certain A/B test experiments.
And what sort of data collection and storage mechanisms does it use for being able to make sure that the data is easy to clean and process and gain insights from?
Yeah, so first of all, maybe a disclaimer. So Expand is not about sort of data fetching parts or data aggregation at all. So it's purely a library, so a collection of statistical functions to evaluate the impact of certain treatment and assign, so the estimated so to say the treatment effect, and as well as the error margin or confidence intervals. And we do have developed a separate kind of tools to aggregate the data beforehand and feed that again into Expand and perform the analysis.
And given the potential complexity of the need for statistical significance in the data for proper A/B testing, how did you design Expand to be able to satisfy those kinds of requirements and make sure that you don't accidentally infer meaning into the results?
Very interesting point. So again, we develop a set of statistical functions to estimate treatment effect, first of all, so the overall effect, and then you can also break down the effect by certain customer features, for example, age, gender, and you can also study the overall effect over time, so to say, in order to identify certain patterns over time. And one of the pitfalls or something to be aware is, of course, the so-called multiple comparison problem. That when you're doing a bunch of kind of hypothesis tests, and in the end, you will, in a statistical sense, you are bound to get some significant results, so to say, if you don't correct for the error rate. And this is also something we really take care of, and kind of a feature of the expand library, and among other things.
And I know that in Germany, the laws around digital privacy are a little bit more consumer-centric than they are in the United States. I'm wondering if there are any special considerations that need to be made in the collection strategy for the data that gets used in Xpan.
Indeed, yeah. So during the like data collection, data aggregation step, we do like ensure, for example, the location of the data has to be in the EU instead of somewhere else, and also we are really careful about customer anonymization. So so to say, always be sure that not to drawing like data sources or where sensitive data can be reconstructed afterwards, or where the anonymization is not done correctly.
And for somebody who wanted to use Xpan in their own projects, what's involved in getting it set up and configuring it?
Yeah, so maybe at this stage I can talk about a bit details about Xpan. So to me, it has mainly three parts which are user facing. So the experiment data class, experiment class, and the results class. So first of all, the first contact of Xpan is so the experiment data class, which is kind of an interface between your data from the experiment and the library, right? So you provide Xpan with some input data, and so the experiment data class handles it and transform it in a way that has kind of a predefined structure which is known to Xpan. And then it give that over to the experiment class, which has all this collection of statistical functions. For example, stuff that I mentioned previously. So the delta function, where you can estimate the impact of the experiment and also the confidence intervals. What we call a subgroup analysis, which is break down the delta, the treatment effect by a certain customer feature. And also trend analysis or over time analysis. So this is also what the user how the user want to interact with the library. So the last part is the results class, which so where we also defined very generic data structure for storing the analysis results, again, which are kind of able to handle all different types of analysis, and in the end easy to be transformed into other data formats or incorporate into other tools or a service.
And earlier on you mentioned that as part of the way that you sort of keep the number of languages and technologies under control is to have your own internal radar. So I'm wondering how you determine the different things that make it onto the radar and where on the radar they end up, so that you can make sure that you have a good view of what technologies are useful and are going to remain stable and usable for some time to come.
So we have a spreadsheet where we can vote if some technology should be adopted or not, and or rolled. So the usual radar things, and everyone can vote on it.
So are there any other topics or questions that you think we should cover while we're here?
Basically that we're trying to boost our contributions and users. So if you go to zalando.github.io, please check out the projects that we're working on. And even if you don't see a feature that you think we should be working on, like file an issue, make a request, and build it yourself too. Just let us know before you start building, because we may have changed plans or something. It's always best to reach out first and say, hi, we'd like to make this change or add this feature. What do you think about it? And then we'll get back to you and let you know. We didn't always have an open source culture, so last year, so that would be spring 2015, we launched this new way of thinking about the tech organization called Radical Agility. And this is based on Daniel Pink's drive, the pillars of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And so with autonomy and purpose, and kind of unleash this renaissance of sorts in open source activity, because teams were free to develop, make their own decisions, release things on GitHub. We said go ahead and do that, and so there's where we got so much activity going. We at one point had 330 projects on our GitHub org, and a lot of them weren't really useful to other people. Like if you didn't work at Zalando, it wasn't necessarily useful. So we've pruned a lot of those projects back. So now we're about 157, and part of this radical agility effort involves speaking more broadly to the industry and really letting the industry know what we're working on and what we're using to develop software. So we greatly invite users and more contributors to test out our work and provide the feedback so that we can keep iterating and making improvements and making things more useful to the community.
Very interesting point, and can also speak for Expand. And so the original idea is, of course, A/B testing is a kind of like a generic problem faced by all companies, or really different companies across different industries. And so that's also why we decided that we want to open source this project. So if you look at different tech companies now, Google, Facebook, they're really putting a lot of effort into open sourcing, it's kind of also data science related projects, machine learning tools, and if you look around for A/B testing, I think we are probably among really first to like publish in a public domain. There are also available tools, but I think they are kind of also sought for different use cases. And we are actually also in talk with different companies here in Berlin and even competitors. So we are really open to suggestions, ideas, comments.
And was the move to more of an open source culture difficult to sell at the business level, or was it just something that sort of started at the technology level and people started doing it, and it was more of an ask forgiveness rather than permission kind of situation?
So before Radical Agility, there was a little bit of open source activity, mainly in the department that Zhao works in, the platform infra world. But when Eric Bowman, the VP of engineering I mentioned earlier, came to Zalando, he's still an active coder, and he manages as an engineer would. He's an engineer, so he works to build a culture that engineers will thrive in and feel challenged in and find their purpose. And so open source is just a part of what an engineer wants to be able to work on when they are at a company. And so there was no need to really sell the idea of open source at the management level, because the manager was already pushing for more open source, even more than some of the engineers who might have felt fear or weren't sure that they could actually open source their work, or hadn't really been working in an environment to date where they could create projects of their own and release them on GitHub. I mean, we have onboarding every month, and we're bringing in lots of people because we have very ambitious hiring goals. And I do the presentation, and a lot of the newcomers still, they come from companies where they weren't allowed to do any open source. And we have privacy considerations, like any company. Working in Germany, you have to follow strict audit and compliance regulations. And we're able to show that you can have all of those requirements and still be able to open source. You just have to do it mindfully. We're not going to open source anything that exposes our customer data or puts us at risk. But that means that we still have tons of freedom to open source libraries and services that can be of general use.
I do think open source first is a really kind of ambitious goal. It's something that we really have to put some kind of effort into that. But in this example, as you also mentioned before, in the case of connection and expand, as long as the project is designed in the first place to be something, that's shareable and that it can be easily decoupled from the rest of the company internal or proprietary stuff. I think this is then, so from my experience, as this mindset is really well accepted and also from the higher level.
Yeah, and just to speak about the open source principles, so we have a how-to. It's just how we open source, and it's on the dashboard. You can find it in the top right corner. And the dashboard, once again, is zalando.github.io. But we actually encourage open source throughout all of the teams. When we did this initially, it meant that sometimes we would put online projects that were really of value to us, but really not to the community. So we've created some parameters around that, as well as a separate GitHub organization, which we just call the incubator. And so on our main org, you find the projects that are mostly truly open source. So they can be used by anybody. They have documentation. They have test coverage in place. Then on the incubator are projects that are in development. So they may be useful at some point to the general public, but in the current state, they're either not or they're so embryonic that a contributor would have trouble figuring out how to actually get started contributing. Some of our teams just want to code in the open and show what they're working on and show off to the community. So that's what the incubator is for. And then we also have launched an inner source pilot for this quarter. So inner source was pretty much steered by PayPal. I think they coined the phrase inner source, and it means that you adopt the open source collaboration model within your tech organization. So for reasons of lack of usefulness to the broader community or privacy, security, things being very tied to the business, you would keep things private on GitHub Enterprise. And so, but if your teams aren't mutually aware of what they are all working on, then you don't maximize the value of that work. It means you can create things in duplicate, create things in a silo, create things that are not going to have long-term use that they otherwise might have if other teams could contribute and help develop it. So we've encouraged this inner source model to really take the best use of our resources and also further reinforce this open source mindset so that eventually some of those projects may go live on GitHub. And even if they don't, and our engineers are still very comfortable working in an open source collaborative model.
Yeah, and by maintaining those same communication patterns as what you would do with an open source project, it makes sure that all of the reasoning and discussion around various changes is accessible to everybody, even the people who weren't directly involved with that work. So it will help prevent too many discussions from just happening person to person and not being captured anywhere for posterity's sake, for when you go back and wonder, why did this change happen? You can actually look at the conversation right there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it also is really valuable in reinforcing the idea of feature teams, which is part of our inner source pilot. So it's technically called the feature teams and inner source pilot. And feature teams are basically that you have a cross-functional team that owned the work that they do end to end and are delivering products of value to customers. And so when you have an open source mindset, the idea is that if you're managing a project, then you're going to develop a lot of other skills in addition to your basic technical coding skills. Ideally, you're going to learn how to establish boundaries around the scope of your project. So you'll be able to accept and reject pull requests very naturally. You'll be able to visualize the long-term life cycle of your project. You'll be able to bring on other committers that can be maintainers. You're going to build a team around your work, and you're going to package a product that other companies, other developers can use. You're going to create a user-friendly experience and develop with user-friendliness in mind. All of these kinds of benefits that we really want to encourage in our own teams.
And one other benefit, too, to the open sourcing aspect of your practices is that by having all of those projects available and externally visible, it serves as a recruiting aid as well, because people who are potentially interested in working with the company can look at the open source work and realize, oh, if I do take this job, then a lot of what I'm doing will be open source and visible to other people, which is a lot of times a motivator for people who are into the open source movement in general.
For sure. And I can see in semi-real time, or sometimes definitely real time, like what the company's actually working on and how they're going about it. Do they practice good design patterns? Do they have a mindful approach to the way they develop? Do they value testing and test coverage and documentation? All of these things can appeal to very good candidates or turn them off, depending on whether they're present and active or not.
And in the dashboard, you also mentioned that you have a set of guidelines for determining whether a project is a good choice for being open sourced. And I'm wondering if there was any inspiration taken from the Best Practices Badge project.
Not directly, no. I mean, the guidelines were developed over the course of a year and accelerated at the turn of the year, so over the winter. So that was a collaborative effort, and some of us may have been influenced by that project.
So are there any other topics that we should discuss before we close out the show?
I think we've covered it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So for anybody who wants to follow you guys and keep in touch with what you're up to, what would be the best way for them to do that?
So we have Twitter. I think we all have Twitter feeds. Zhao and I do.
I have Twitter. I think I also have links to everything on my GitHub page. Okay. I have to check. Wait a minute.
Sure. Yeah, I'll add in all your contact info into the show notes, so anybody who's interested in getting in touch can look at the show notes on the pythonpodcast.com page. So with that, I'll take us into the picks. My pick today is the Hacker's Keyboard on Android. Lately, I've been doing a bit of work on my tablet just by SSHing into my SaltStack server, and having the Hacker's Keyboard makes it much more friendly for doing work in the terminal versus the standard Android keyboard. So for anybody who happens to be in a situation where you need to do any sort of work on the command line or in a text editor, having that keyboard is much better for that kind of work. And with that, I will pass it on to you, Jay.
Usually I like to read when I commute to work, and one of the recent books I've read is called Shah of Shahs. So it's about the history immediately before the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And it's just a kind of interesting period of history to me, and also something new, I would say. So I learned quite a lot, which I've never been exposed before.
And Joao, how about you?
Okay, I would pick a word, serendipity. So I usually just pick a book or a movie or whatever, and I found out that just reading random books, even from something that I usually don't read, sometimes I get inspiration for technical solutions and for other things in life. So that's my pick.
That's a good one. Lori, how about you?
So I just picked up Flow by Mihaly. I'm going to mispronounce his name, but he was a psychologist, and it was released in the 90s, and I'm rereading it. So the book is about how anybody who gets so into a topic that it sort of feels like their time just becomes something other, and they just work and focus on and concentrate on what they're doing, so that either hours can seem like minutes or vice versa. And this book explores like how people get into flow and how flow can really add a lot of value to someone's life because they're aligned with purpose and understand their purpose and can work and act with purpose. Even if you're on an assembly line doing the same repetitive task, you can still get flow and find value and meaning and purpose just by that task if you gamify the activity or come up with some other creative way to add value or apply value and meaning to it.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to tell us more about the work you're doing at Zalando and some of the projects that you've created there. And I'm sure that our listeners will be interested and appreciate that as well.
All right. And thank you so much for having us on.
Thanks.